Back row, are we all good? Tech team, are we good? Okay. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thank you for having me back again. We're going to do things a little bit differently this time. So I was about halfway through this week, had almost all the slides prepped and ready to go, and then Thursday I decided to change the whole outline. So there are no slides. So this time around, I felt like it would be a good idea for us to discuss the topic of how do we approach the Bible. Specifically, what kind of mindset do we have when we come to it? So something I've noticed quite often in a lot of the Sabbath gatherings I've been to, and something that I have to confess I've been a part of on occasion, is oftentimes we get into bantering tidbits of knowledge. We start throwing back and forth, well, I know what this word means, or I know this little fun fact, or I know this historical fact, and it ends up really becoming a discussion of who has more knowledge and who knows more than everybody else. And while knowledge has its place, and it is still good, from sitting on the sidelines occasionally and watching it take place, you really get the impression that the passion there is for self-knowledge rather than passion for God. And just kind of want to address maybe where that issue lies and how we might be able to address that. So when we stop and we examine the society that we come out of, the period in history that we are currently in, it's hard to really blame us for interacting that way with one another, because that's what society does. Especially here in the States, it's all about me having my opinion and me proving to you that my opinion is right and yours is wrong. And even coming out of the church, the whole idea of apologetics is that you're able to argue your belief and prove to someone why you are right and they're wrong. But I have to wonder if maybe that's not necessarily the best way to approach the Bible or even to present our beliefs about the Bible. Oops. So, to kind of start things off, when we examine the Bible, how would you summarize that? As what kind of book that is? What is your purpose for going to the Bible? Is it a book that you go to for answers? To have a hard and fast decision on what is ultimate truth? And if we stop and we examine it, for the latecomers, we're not starting back over. You just have to pick up where we're at. So if
Is that rhetorical, or would you like
for right now, I'm just going to do rhetorical. So if the Bible is to be a book of answers, then something we would expect to happen is that there would be a lot of answers, a lot of definitions given in the Bible. But when you stop and you look at the Bible, you don't get quite as many answers as you do questions. You get definitions, and you do get some answers in there, but oftentimes the narrative lends itself to questions. You're often wondering, why is the Bible repeating itself so often? What I'm reading now a repetition from what I read just a few chapters ago, or even within the same chapter? Wondering why I'm getting obscure details about this character or this place when they have no place in the story within the immediate context. you wonder why sometimes there's a broken narrative about why we're carrying along a perfectly good train of thought, and then we break off to talk about this person over here, and then we come back to our story. So a lot of these questions come up naturally, almost as if it's the author's intention that you stop and you ask questions. And so if we take that context for the Bible, it seems to suggest that the Bible's intent is more along the lines of us asking questions rather than a book that we go to get answers. You have to bear with me. I'm trying to remember why I wrote this note. So, and that's not to say that the answers are specifically not in the Bible, or that that's not what the Bible is concerned about, but rather the idea that's suggested in that is that the asking of the question and the seeking to find the answer is more important than having the right answer versus the wrong answer. And sometimes when you go to investigate that answer, you might have several different people come up with several different answers. That doesn't necessarily make one right and the rest of them wrong. You could have several of them be on the right train, the right track, but not necessarily so cut and dry as one's right and the others are false. So one example that we can give with that, if you would, turn with me to Genesis chapter 2. The second chapter of the book of Genesis. I'm going to start in verse 8. Yah Elohim planted a garden in Eden, in the east, and there he placed the man he had formed. Yah Elohim caused to grow out of the ground every tree pleasing in appearance and good for food, including the tree of life in the middle of the garden, as well as the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So if we stop and we look at this passage, what are some of the questions that you might stop and ask about what's interesting about these details?
Why did he plant the tree, the knowledge of good and evil?
There's one. Why did he plant the tree? How about where did he plant the tree?
And why say don't touch it?
Right. Why later on, when he's talking to Adam, we read that you're allowed to eat of every tree of the garden. The fruit is good to eat. But there's something wrong with eating the fruit of this one particular tree. Then if we continue on, we look through Genesis chapter 3, and we start to examine what Adam and Eve are doing, then we can start asking more precise questions. So for example, we're told that in Genesis 2 that the other trees of the garden are meant to be pleasing in appearance and seen as good for food. And then later on, when Eve stops to examine the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she says the same thing. She sees that it is a tree that is pleasing to the eye and desirable. What are some of the other questions that we might be able to stop and ask about this passage, and more specifically, why Yah has the reaction that he does when Adam and Eve choose to eat from the tree. And this time it's not a rhetorical question.
Well, not to answer that question, but a question that comes up, it says in the east, so east of where, or the location again, but
Yep, that would be another good question to dig into.
Yeah, what east means.
In the first verse that you read, it says he planted a garden in the east, and there he placed the man he had formed. So does that mean that the man was made somewhere else besides Eden and then grew?
Yep, it would seem to suggest that.
I just realized, Yah came along asking questions, not making accusations. He like asked questions to suss out where they were. Not,
Yep.
not only physically, but because he knew, but like spiritually.
Yep.
What's going on, guys?
Adam, where are you?
What have you done? Who told you? What have you done?
So one of the questions that I would like to get to is, what specifically was so evil about Adam and Eve eating from that tree? Was it the fact that this tree was particularly poisonous to mankind? Was it that this tree had something inherent about it in the physical action that was taking place? Or was there perhaps an underlying sin behind the physical action where by Adam and Eve performing that act, they were in fact committing another sin alongside of that?
I get a little bit of this from the Bible Project's take on this, but it wasn't the fact that God said you can't have discernment, you can't have wisdom, you can't know the difference between good and evil, because humans need that to rule on his behalf in the world. It was taking it apart from his giving. So we define good and evil apart from him, and that always leads to disaster.
Yes, because something interesting. So the tree is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In order for God to create something, he had to have a knowledge of that thing. And so it wasn't the fact that having the knowledge of good and evil was wrong. But I tend to lean more towards the idea that Adam and Eve were changing the judgment for themselves. They were putting themselves in the place of the judge. And I believe there's actually a rabbinic midrash on that is what Adam and Eve were doing, was that they were taking the seat of judgment. They themselves were choosing what was right and what was evil. Yes, sir.
This might be the last thing I'm allowed to say. But in your topic, how we approach the Bible, we have already taken the approach in everything that's been said here, that what we're reading literally happened. That there was a garden that God placed a man in, and this tree. We've already taken the approach that all that is literal. What if it isn't? That's all I'll say.
Oh, yeah.
Other questions at that point.
Yep, and that will definitely tie into a later part of this discussion.
I always wondered why there wasn't any evil yet. Then I realized there was. Like when you said not because everything was good, all of creation was good. They hadn't sinned yet, and there was no evil. But then I realized there must have been evil because the serpent was evil because he was tempting them to do something that, So that's what I thought. Well, what? There is no evil, because everything's good. Then.
Yep, quite possibly. We could have the case that Adam and Eve weren't necessarily the first sin, that the serpent was. We also have the possibility that what the serpent did in tempting them wasn't evil, but he was tempting them to evil.
And I kept thinking, was he really a serpent? I mean, what kind of form was he? Because it seems like he was a serpent after when he was on his belly.
Could be, yeah.
To go with what Larry said, I've come up with my thought process a few years ago. Fruit is usually a deed and elsewhere in the Bible, and so partaking of the fruit of knowledge and good and evil was a bad fruit, so to speak, because it was disobedience, and disobedience in the way the Hebrews chapter 3 I think explains it is disobedience is unbelief. So the failure to trust God in choosing life, choosing the tree of life, versus the knowledge of good and evil, doing it your own way, which produced bad fruit, which is fruit of the tree type of mentality. So not necessarily a real life took the fruit and took a bite, but whatever it was, you consumed poor information from what's called the serpent, that's what it says, and then your fruit was not good from that point.
Yeah, very well could be.
And like Larry, I might not be able to say anything after this. I'm not suggesting in any way that Satan was not evil, but just that was his purpose. His purpose perhaps could have been to, once we had the knowledge, we were better off without having the knowledge of good and evil. Once we had that, then we made our decisions, and perhaps his purpose is just to tempt us and see where we are.
Yep, that's a very good question.
Not that he's not evil, but perhaps it's just we all have a purpose, and that's his.
So I appreciate you guys working with me on that and asking good questions about it. And I'm not saying that necessarily that Adam and Eve taking judgment for themselves and overruling God's judgment is the exact right answer. But it does illustrate a good point for us. That when we approach the Bible and we say, this is what it says, and if you don't agree with me, you're wrong, now I've become the judge. Now I'm committing the same sin that Adam and Eve committed. Whereas if I'm allowing other people to have a different opinion than myself and recognizing that I don't have all the right answers and I don't have to, then I can avoid the potential of being my own judge and being a judge of other people, and allow them to help me in my growth and my understanding, and I'm able to help them in theirs. So one of the things that we can do if we come across a thought or a concept that seems to fit in one portion of the Bible, then we see if it shows up in other places. What do I mean? So we have the idea that intent, with what Adam and Eve did, if their intention was to be a judge for themselves, and that is the sin of why eating the fruit was evil, then we would see this theme appear other places throughout the Bible as well. Obviously, I have a few examples. Would there be one or two that you guys can think of?
I always like to see if it is said anywhere else, and made me go to Hosea 6, if that's one of your examples. Hosea 6 and 7 it says, but like Adam they transgressed the covenant, there they dealt, as like Kenny said, faithlessly with me.
Sorry, Zach was distracting me.
If you want to talk, let me know. I got a microphone here. Sorry.
Yes, please.
My mom was giving me eyes, so if I see your hand go up, I'm going to shove it in your face. I'm kidding. Oh, you're good. If you're loud, I won't butt you.
All right, yep. So yeah, we have an example in Hosea directly referencing the sin of Adam. Would there be any other examples?
I've out when you turn there, that's straight for me.
Run, Zach.
Yep. Psalm 82, some of you may be familiar with it. God standeth in the congregation of the mighty, he judgeth among the gods. How long will you judge unjustly, and accept the persons of the wicked? Defend the poor and the fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and the needy, rid them out of the hand of the wicked. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said you are gods, all of you, children of the Most High, but you shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit the nations. And so I see this as the spiritual equivalent of what happened in the garden.
Yep, and that would be another very good example to that. You said that was Psalm 82? So one example that came to my mind when I was considering is intent. Does intent have anything to do with whether or not an action is evil? And the first place my mind went to would be in Deuteronomy, where Yah tells the people to have a circumcised heart, that they need to remove the hardness of their hearts to learn to love Him with all that they are in order to be called His people. And we even see that's one of Yeshua's main ministry points throughout all of the gospel accounts, is that He's more concerned about the intent of the heart in the action as opposed to purely the action in and of itself. So one thing that we can do would be to go to Deuteronomy chapter 30. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 10 would be the first one to go to. So in Deuteronomy 10, verse 16, we read the first time that Yah instructs His people to be circumcised in heart. He says, "Therefore, circumcise your hearts and don't be stiff-necked any longer." And obviously there's the greater context there in regards to what Yah requires of His people. But more to the point of our discussion today, I would be curious to know, how do we understand what a circumcised heart is? Because if we stop and we consider that concept, we know what normal circumcision entails, and we wouldn't expect that to be applied to this passage as well. So how would we understand this idea of circumcision?
I think in Acts 2:37, after Peter's speaking in the temple in Shavuot, he said everybody was pricked in their heart. So
Yep.
they felt, oh, we got. And then verse 38, he says, first words, repent. In the King James version, in that verse, change. So they were convicted.
So conviction and repentance being one of the ways of having a circumcised heart.
Could be, yeah.
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 Are you warm, or are you just raising your hand?
Mine is by looking at a fruit of a person.
Mm-hmm.
And when we say heart, it'd be like center of the mind or seat of the person's life, correct?
Yeah.
I speaking to this lady one time, she goes, "Oh, I believe my heart." I said, "No, that one pumps blood." Just talking
Yeah.
about the heart, the center, the foundation.
Not referring to your intellect, but to the seat of your emotions.
Yeah.
And so a couple of the other passages that we can go to kind of discern what it is to have a circumcised heart. So Yah kind of gives the inverse of this instruction back in Leviticus 26, where he says that if the people who have an uncircumcised heart will humble themselves, then he will be their God. And we see this echoed later on in Ezekiel, Ezekiel 36, where he talks about taking out the heart of stone and giving his people a heart of flesh.
I heard a translated that, it says, heart of flesh. I heard another translation say, I'll give you a tender heart. So that spoke to me a lot.
Oh yeah.
Giving you a heart of flesh, it just seems, I don't know, it spoke to me, much clearer.
Which would go along with the Deuteronomy passage about not being stiff-necked.
Yeah. Soften your heart.
So there is a reason why I brought up these two passages, the one in Genesis and then the one in Deuteronomy, and I had us go through this little practice, this little exercise. So what we just did in trying to have a discussion and try to discern the truth of a matter is we went through a process that the Jews actually refer to as Pardes, which is an acronym for different steps of gaining understanding. So where you begin your process by looking at the basic initial understanding. So like what we did with Adam and Eve, where we looked at the physical evidence of what was being discussed with the tree. Then you move on to looking to see if there's hints or clues in other places of the Bible, whether in Torah or then also in the prophets, to see if there's a greater understanding that can be gained there in comparison. And from those two, you're able to go into the third step, which would be discussing truth on the matter. I don't know if anyone's interested in looking more into Pardes, the Pardes method of study. If you are, you can, the way it would be spelled for you to search it out would be capital P, lowercase r, or lowercase a, capital R, capital D, lowercase e, and then capital S.
Could you repeat that?
Capital P, lowercase a, capital R, capital D, lowercase e, capital S. And each one of those capital letters refers to a different Hebrew word. And that's how the acronym helps you to remember the different steps to it. But this is one of the methods that's been tried and tested in regards to trying to gain understanding of different passages and being able to cultivate more questions to generate a more beneficial searching, and even how to deal with different answers to that same question.
Should I just Google that? And
Yes, sir. Yep, you can Google, Bing,
what kind of
DuckDuckGo,
resources?
whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources.
Mhm.
For that. Okay, good.
It's mainly just an outline of how to study a passage. I don't know if there's necessarily going to be any textbooks on it or anything like that. Yes, sir.
Pardes is Peshat, Remez, Drosh, and Sod.
Right.
Peshat, as you said, is the literal, plain meaning of the text. Remez is hints, allegorical interpretations, allusions. Drosh is derived meanings, homiletical interpretations, so like, what can we get from it?
Mhm.
And then Sod is secret or mystical, like a deeper level understanding.
And with the Sod, it's more the understanding that that's something you can't be taught. You have to receive that from God directly.
I have a quick example of that, I heard at least, and I didn't come up with it, but when Yeshua tells Peter that flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you.
He was referring to the Sod understanding, yes. And then just kind of interesting aside. So the third step in discussion about how to understand the Bible, the drash, and that's understanding, okay, how do the text, how does it apply to us? That's the root of the word midrash, of what we're doing right now, where we are engaging in a discussion about how does the text, how does the Bible apply to us in our day-to-day lives.
So how do, we're just trying to live it, right? That's what you meant.
Yes.
How to live it. Yeah.
Yep. Because we can come to different passages of the Bible and we can come to different interpretations of how to do it, and everyone's going to have a different idea. Like what Brother Kenny brought up a couple weeks ago with discussion about kindling a fire on Sabbath. There's a lot of different interpretations of what that is, what that looks like, why it is or is not important for us to kindle a fire or not kindle a fire on Sabbath. And that's where having that discussion of everyone bringing their own interpretations, their own opinions in and being able to talk about it, then we can all glean something greater.
I'm thinking we're commanded to love our neighbor as ourselves and love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. In like Deuteronomy 22, it says if your neighbor, whoever, if they lose their livestock, to hold on to it so you can give it back to them. But there's not a whole lot of instruction for our society, so I'm praying to God and teach me how to do that. You know, if I have something, I did room with a guy for a while, and he ended up moving on. He left some stuff behind. He left a valuable coin behind, and I didn't see it for a couple of years, and I held on to it. And then I ran to him and goes, "Hey, you got that item?" I said, "Yeah, I'll get it to you tomorrow." He was so happy.
There you go.
Yeah, there's
It's a blessing to be able to live that.
Apply that in your life.
Yeah.
You know, because people are different. You know.
Oh yeah.
If somebody had a weakness and it was my strength, I would, build the body and show them what to do. You know, and I'd work with them, or like, I was at a public pool and this child saw me swimming, and how do you do that? So I started teaching them all the little, aspects of how to swim. They could save a life someday, and
Yeah.
it takes some growth and development. Because I know my parents first took us to a public pool, they got us swimming lessons. They showed us how to go through the motions, but I didn't know how to do it. I got the pool and I pushed off, and I was doing the stroke, and I just sank to the bottom, and I'm laying on the bottom of the pool doing the stroke, and it wasn't working. They didn't show the heart behind it.
Yeah.
That effort that you have to put in and stuff. I didn't understand, so they didn't get that part. So,
Well, and that's part of what we're trying to do with our Sabbath gatherings. Discuss the steps of what we need to go through, but then also try to find that heart behind it about why we do it.
How do you live for the Almighty? I just, when I was growing up, I was raised in a church, a Catholic church, and I was taught that, well, you give them an hour a week, and then as soon as we do communion, you haul us out the door.
Yep.
And just, you only have to give the Almighty an hour a week. No, that's not, He wants your life.
So in talking about finding the heart behind the instructions, that actually brings us into my next point. So when we're learning to approach the Bible, and I kind of touched a little bit on this earlier about how we come at it from a very black and white, there's one right answer, and then every other answer is false. In that perspective, we're coming at it in the view that the Bible is a textbook to teach us the correct method and the correct answers so that we know how to pass the test, basically. Whereas in this other perspective that I'm trying to suggest is we view the Bible more as a guidebook. It equips you with what you need in order to search out the right answers, but it's not going to give you all the right answers. And that falls more in line with the idea of a Greek Western mindset versus a Eastern Hebrew mindset. Whereas in more of our Greek mindset, we're looking at things as very cut and dry. There can only be one correct answer, and it's my opinion versus everybody else's opinion, because I can't hold on to my opinion and then consider someone else's position as possibly true without compromising my own. Whereas in a more Hebraic concept of that, you can have opposing opinions and discuss those opposing opinions and still everyone be able to glean and to learn something from that without anyone compromising their faith or compromising what it is that they believe in, and actually being able to have the opportunity to grow into something greater and something better. Real quick, is everyone following along okay so far? Do I need to go back and revisit anything? I have a lot of blank stares. So then one of the other things I want to discuss is when we're looking at different perspectives, oftentimes when we look at, say, the person of Yeshua, the person of Jesus, and we often think of him only in terms of him being Messiah, only in terms of him being Savior. But do we ever stop and consider him in terms of being a rabbi? And if we start to look more into the idea of what a rabbi was during that time period, a rabbi, everything he did and everything that he said was for the purpose of teaching, for instructing his students. Not that he's giving them the answers, but that he's pointing them in the right direction of, if you want the answer to your question, then you need to head this direction, and that's where you're going to find it. And more or less, the idea is that he's teaching a perspective or a lens to his disciples, to his Talmudim. And for someone to be a Talmudim, a disciple of a rabbi, you learn that lens, and that's how you interpret the rest of Scripture. So one of the primary things that Yeshua taught as a biblical lens is in regards to the first and second greatest commandments. Do you guys remember what those are? Obviously.
Love God, our strength, love neighbor, so.
But if you were to ask various rabbis during Yeshua's time, you would actually get different answers. The first greatest commandment was always, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. But then different rabbis would give different answers as to what the second greatest commandment was, which is how they built or what the foundation of their lens, their perspective of the rest of the Bible was based off of. So in Yeshua putting love your neighbor as yourself as the second greatest commandment, that was his lens of how he interpreted all of Torah and all of the prophets. He was more focused on, I'm trying to have a relationship with the Father, and I need to love my neighbor enough to help them have a relationship with the Father. And so when we're looking at this idea of being able to bring opposing opinions together, we have to remember that everyone is hopefully on a genuine search to know God and to be found pleasing in his sight. And we need to help one another in that search rather than try to tear one another down with our opposing views. And I'm not talking about, just a variance in how you interpret the text. Where someone might say, well, the way you have a circumcised heart is by repentance, or the way you have a circumcised heart is by being humble. I'm not talking about just those things. Those things would be included as well, but I'm also talking more of the controversial topics. So that when topics like what is the shape of the earth, how do you pronounce the name of God, what are some other ones? Calendar is another one. Is there a Trinity or is there not? Who is the person of Yeshua? Like when we get into topics like that, we should be able to have those conversations without feeling like we have to defend our belief, without feeling like we have to attack their belief and proving them wrong, but rather trying to understand where they're coming from in their belief. Because most times, if someone has a genuine belief, they came to it through a process. They came to it because that's what made sense to them. It's not if they're holding to a belief just because teacher so and so said so, then that's not a discussion worth having. But if they genuinely have a reason for why they hold to that belief, why they believe that that is true, then there's benefit in having that conversation of, okay, so so and so believes that, you pronounce the name of God this way. Or they might say, you shouldn't say the name, period. Why do you believe that? What led you to conclude that? And when you're trying to understand their perspective, it will help bring to light things for you to benefit from as well.
Just for an example of what you were just talking about, a couple of Sukkot, I don't think you had actually arrived yet, but I had an indication that actually one of those topics would come up, shaking yours and all that sort of thing. So driving out there, I'm like, I'm praying. I know we can have this conversation. I also know that this is one of those that has a lot of questions that have no answers, which basically, in that kind of topic, makes the questions useless. Okay? There is no definitive answer. And you're not going to get anywhere with this stuff. But we can talk about it. I got there, I no sooner got my stuff set up, walked back over to where the grill's going already. Here it comes, man. Okay, you know what? We talked about that for the rest of the day. It went in a little bit the next morning. Nobody got any heartburn. We
Yep.
went through that and it was done with, and we had a great code. We proved that we could do it. And that was what my heart was when we went there. Whatever the topic was, but I just happened to have an inkling that that would be part of it. And I thought, we could talk about that without, having any problem. And we did. We were able to do that. And so to me, that was the upshot of all that, doing exactly what you're talking about right there. There are things that are definitely answered for us, okay? But there are other things that are definitely not answered for us. Okay? Yeah, you can do endless thought experiments with these things. That's good mental exercise, maybe spiritual, maybe, okay? But the fact is, if we set our minds to discuss these things without the idea of bringing up heartburn to anybody, it can happen. We have to have the will to do it first and realize that really whatever you think on some of these subjects, like the ones you just brought up, those are actually the ones that tend to get people hardened on
Yep.
the subject.
Especially on subjects that we can't come to a definitive answer on.
Exactly, and that's the ones we tend to gravitate to. If we can kind of say, okay, look, doesn't mean we can't talk about these things, but there's a time and a place for it, there's a way to do it. Other things we do have examples for. I'm just going to go here real quick to the mountain just before the Lord is going to speak with the people.
Okay.
Right? Don't come up on the mountain. Don't let any animals come up on the mountain. It says that they put signs around the mountain. Okay? This is an answer. There are no questions, okay? There are no questions about that. Don't come on the mountain. There is no why. There is no, it's like, don't go on the mountain, okay? If you do, you'll die. Animal or human. I don't have any questions about that. I'm not going on about. I could say, well, why is it that way? I'd be asking like my dad, like, why can't I go run out in the road, okay, with traffic, all right? It's like, it's kind of obvious, you know? So there are those things. I'm just making a dialectical example.
Yep.
Okay. So that's all I have. But I was very proud and thankful and blessed by that whole thing to see us be able to do that. Doesn't mean there wasn't, okay, was there, some adamant discussion? That's all right.
Oh, for sure.
Not a problem with that. But nobody got hot, you know? It was actually a very good experience to see that we could do that. I was so proud of my brother.
I think it's a great example of a little bit what you're talking about of difference of cultures is we've been taught, indoctrinated, whatever, in our culture that when we go to speak on a subject, our viewpoint is right and we need to speak so that the other person agrees with us. Where realistically, we can have a conversation, never agree, but still respect what the other person says. Like it's all about changing the perspective and you're talking to understand the other person. That doesn't mean you have to agree with the other person. And you being able, like that's amazing. We should be able to have more conversations like that with people.
It was really good.
Real quick.
So my thought is that we should be able to have these discussions in the right spirit, and the way I see it, we can be either of Jerusalem or Babylon. And Jerusalem requires unity to work properly, and Babylon requires uniformity. Okay? The people in Babel, we are all of one voice and one speech, and we can do this. And even Elohim says, when they're united like this, there's nothing they can't do. So we confuse their languages. And so we can have differences here in the kingdom. In Jerusalem, we can have differences, but if we're unified, then that's okay. Differences can help, differences can hurt, but it's the spirit of Babylon that says you have to toe the line, my way or the highway. We all have to be one, and so any little differences, oh, you're out. You're not really one of us. And that can be how we hold midrashic discussions too.
That's very true.
One other thing with that, that we as human beings do is we engage in what I call the unconscious cowardice of conformity.
Okay.
We will do that on the other side. Okay. So thought is required. That means you got to ask questions about certain things. You know, there are things that it is useful to ask in-depth questions, follow them out, and extrapolate even to at least a certain degree. You know, there are other things. I ran into this in electrical theory, all kinds of questions, because it's theory, all right? But when I see high voltage placard right here, I got no questions. No questions at all. Okay? I know that danger. Now, if somebody says, what's the theory behind that? Then we got some questions, we got a discussion, you know? So I'm just trying to put it in those ways, so that went well. Okay, that's kind of my approach. Okay. I do have questions about a lot of stuff's in the Bible, but there's some high voltage placards in there, caution signs, stop signs.
Yeah.
It's okay, stop.
And that's not to say that there's no value in asking questions about those high voltage signs. So like with your example about the signs being posted around the mountain about don't come up here, there would be value in asking, well, why not?
That's
Because,
for afterwards.
right, and
For after.
in regards to, all of the Bible, we're afterwards.
We're kind of, and I'll just throw this out too, and we have an advantage here, that we are reading these things on leaves of a book,
Mhm.
right? So we can be within seconds to minutes in our thought processes, where they gotta wait hours, days, weeks, and years. At that point, when you're right in it, you have time for some questions, maybe, okay? That of the type that you're talking about. We can jump so fast beyond that and look back. And again, as has been brought up, we're tending to not realize that this is an Asian book, it's not Western, okay, it's Asian, all right?
Oh, Middle Eastern, but yeah.
That's Asian. So, there you are, you know. The mindset that I've been striving to get to, and I see others doing it too, is to change out of our daily Western mode, Greco-Roman, Roman-Greco, all that, and try to, if I don't have to operate in Greco-Roman, I'm not, you know. But that's taken a while. It does take a while for us to get to that point where we can do that. So, anyway.
And well, that's one of the things that I would recommend and suggest is that specifically in regards to what would be considered controversial topics, a lot of times they become so heated is because we're trying to prove right or wrong instead of asking what's the value in either side of that. And sometimes I feel like we're asking the wrong questions altogether. So for just as a quick example, you know, in the whole debate about what shape the earth is, the last time I checked, the Bible is not a science book, and the people who wrote it aren't writing from the perspective of a scientific approach or analysis of creation. They're writing from their perspective of what creation looks like. And so in the discussion of flat versus round earth, the better question to ask is what is the writer's perspective? Not asking if it's right or wrong, but what perspective are they writing from, and how is that going to affect how they talk about different things, and how is that going to affect the words that they use to describe it? It doesn't matter to them, and ultimately to whatever points that they make as to whether or not the earth is flat or round. Same thing with the discussion about the name of Yah. There's something to be said for why we don't necessarily know how it's pronounced, how it's spoken. There's something to be said for seeking out what the name of Yah means and how to pronounce it. You know, there's a couple different theories as to what the name of Yah is and how to pronounce the full Yod He Vav He. You know, in the idea that, like one of the examples I've come across is that if you overlay the 3 different Hebrew words for existence in past, present, and future, you get the Yod He Vav He. But then again, on the other side of that, you have the discussion of why we should avoid attempting to pronounce his name, because you could end up profaning him and how you pronounce it, or insulting him and how you pronounce it, and incurring sin on yourself. There's open discussion and there's things to be said for both sides. So in learning to have a better lens, a better perspective in how we look at the Bible, and considering that we need to ask better questions about the things that are in the Bible, one of the things that I think is valuable to us is that we need to learn to expect that we're going to miss the mark when we're attempting to find answers, and just expect that for other people as well. But if we're all working together to compare notes about how I missed the mark here and how you missed the mark over here, now we can get a little bit closer together as to where we need to be aiming and the direction we need to be going. Something to not be left out of that discussion would be not just hearing different opinions within Torah observant groups, but even various opinions from without Torah observant groups. So whether that's reading commentaries from Protestant pastors, Catholic priests, or even Jewish rabbis, learning to read their opinions and be able to glean truth from those is something that would benefit us as well, instead of trying to spend all of our time coming up with rebuttals and arguments against why their belief is wrong. Something that I find kind of interesting. So when we're considering Yeshua being a rabbi and the discussions that he had with other rabbis of his time, we can actually compare some of his teachings with some of theirs that are contained within the Talmud. And I'm not sure have we ever, I believe Terry's got into a little bit about what exactly the Talmud is. I'm not sure if everyone here has had the privilege to sit in on that discussion. But the Talmud is basically just a collection of the teachings and opinions of various rabbis over the course of the years. And I believe that the teachings stopped with Rabbi Bar Kokhba. Maybe someone can help me verify that. But he would have been considered the last. The Hebrew is shmika, but I guess a good equivalent would be ordination. The last rabbi to receive ordination, to be an official teacher, to speak with authority on the Bible. So prior to him, all these other rabbis gave their discussions, gave their opinions, and that's what's contained within the pages of the Talmud itself. And so the idea is that those are teachings to help students later on learn and understand what the Bible is talking about and how to get interpretation from the Bible for Midrash, for how you live your life out, for how you live out the faith of the Word.
I just throw something in. The way that I remember it, or help me, I guess, understand it. Do I hold it? Check. Thank you. The way that I kind of hold on to it or understand it is Talmud, if it's the shorter version of Talmudim, which would be a disciple, would be
A student.
discipline of, and so the instructions or the discipline, and then therefore the Talmudim follow the discipline or instructions from that their rabbi would have held to.
Right. And actually, I have heard discussion before that if it wasn't for the fact that there was a parting of ways between the Jewish believers and then the non-Jewish believers of Yeshua, and some of the things that the Christians teach about the person of Yeshua, if it wasn't for those things, the Jews would actually be willing to consider Yeshua as part of their Talmudic teachings, as adding to the discussion. And that's basically what the Talmud is meant to do, is meant to record a discussion of how to interpret the Bible. And Yeshua's words would have been considered applicable to that as well.
But they don't like being replaced.
Well, and then that could be part of a misunderstanding of, or misinterpretation of what was meant in the Bible. Because there are some Christian doctrines that I personally can't find where that's in the Bible, or where it might be misconstrued.
Yeah. But you can see why they would look at it and think, I don't want any part of that.
Right. And so I know in having this discussion about asking questions and being able to not necessarily prove one way or another, but that the whole thing is a discussion, the whole thing is a question. That doesn't mean that you can't hold on to something and believe in it. But the idea is that you have confident humility in your belief. You're confident enough in what you believe to change and alter your life in accordance with that, but then you're humble enough to recognize that you have shortcomings, you are limited on your understanding, and you can still learn and glean something from somebody else that may or may not change how you believe and ultimately change how you live your life.
I'm very enthusiastic about my own opinion. Am I as
Everyone is.
enthusiastic about someone else's opinion? Am I as willing to listen to them as I want them to be willing to listen? I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the two greatest commandments, do I love my brother enough to love him as myself and listen to him as wholeheartedly as I want him to listen to me?
That's very true. Because when we stop and we start looking at being able to hold other people's opinion, not that you believe it, but that you esteem it as something valuable, because you see in them a desire to know the Father and to serve Him, and to know how to live out His word in their life, then you value the opinion not because it's true or false, but because of what you see in the person that you're discussing with. I find it kind of interesting that a lot of times when Yah talks about his people, he often compares them to plants, specifically to vines, to grapevines. And I kind of wonder, because oftentimes, our first thought is, well, grapevine, good fruit, bad fruit. And that's the interpretation we take, and we just kind of leave it there. But I wonder if maybe there's a little bit more benefit to understanding that comparison and extrapolating that interpretation a little bit further. So if we stop and we consider a grapevine, which I wish I had pictures to show, they all start from the same place. They all start from the same trunk, the same root. They have the same starting point. And they all have the same ultimate goal, to bear fruit. But if you stop and you compare one branch to another, you are never going to find two branches that are the same. And a lot of times, a good vine dresser will be able to trim away the unnecessary portions and to train in different directions for the branches so that they can better serve the rest of the vine and produce better fruit. And so, in looking at us being the branches of that vine, of being part of Yah's vineyard, we have to bear in mind that each branch that we're sitting next to is growing in different directions and in different ways. If there's a part of their growth that's going to get cut away, it's not going to be because of us. And if there's a change in direction that needs to happen, it's not going to be because of us. We have to be doing our part and making sure that we're not overbearing on another branch, that we're not causing stress on another branch. And interestingly enough, just as it is with the human body, in trees, some portions can become cancerous to the rest of the tree. And at that point, it would need to be cut off entirely. And so taking that perspective of the changes that need to happen aren't going to result from us, but rather a result from the vine dresser, then we help one another in lifting each other up and bearing and producing greater fruit. We mentioned earlier about being able to discuss controversial topics, but maybe something to bear in mind with that is to discuss them in moderation, because it's not beneficial to bring up every debatable topic every time we get together. And if you have a habit of bringing up the same topic every time you talk to somebody, you probably need to take a step back from that topic, because no one wants to hear it as much as you do. So, in coming to our discussion about being the branches, being the vines of Yah's vineyard, we find ourselves back in the garden where we started our discussion, and focusing on bearing good fruit and fulfilling what Yah created Adam to do, which is to be his image, to be the one that represented him to the rest of his creation. And in light of that, we do need to have a few honorable mentions, I guess, about that there are certain things that are worthwhile for separation to be over. You know, if someone comes in and says, you know, you can only discuss the 5 books of Moses and the rest of the Bible is not relevant. It's not that you can't have a discussion with them, but it's probably not someone that you're going to be fellowshipping with on a regular basis. If you have someone who says that, you know, I think that all the prophets in the Bible are false prophets, you know, now we're, you know, again, we're still able to discuss with them, but we're not going to be fellowshipping with them very often. Now, I would say that I've heard a lot of people talk about their non-negotiable list of things that they say, you know, if these questions come up, I'm not talking about it. I think if we're going to be genuine seekers of Yah and genuinely love our neighbor as ourselves, if our neighbor has a genuine question about any given topic, we need to be willing to have that discussion, have that conversation with them, not to cut them off and say, well, you know, you're going down the path of denying Paul, or going down the path of saying that there's another savior besides Yeshua, or what have you. Even if they are going down that path, do you think debating with them, do you think arguing with them about why they're wrong, or even just cutting the conversation off period, is going to benefit them in any way? Or do you think you should have that discussion, be willing to understand where they're coming from on that, and not feel like your faith is in danger, but that you can have that discussion and maybe be able to share why you are where you are at? And those are just some brief examples. So I hope that I wasn't too confusing today. Like I said, I rewrote this entire thing on Thursday. But that is all I have to share with you guys for right now. Do you guys have any questions?
Any suggestions for resources on digging in how to get the Hebrew? What for Sukkot they recommend is Brad's cut.
Mm-hmm. Let this mind be in you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like search out that type of word. You ask the questions in the right way. Look at the show, and addresses how to ask questions to words. I know I do know he magnified his word above all his name, and I could think of another stop sign. The Deuteronomy 13 test.
Mm-hmm.
Stop sign.
So as far as recommendations, probably the easiest to do would be just look up different teachers from different, just different belief backgrounds. And, you know, we've all had enough experience with listening to teachers to know when all they want to do is just debate everybody else, when they want to just tear down the way that other people look at things, versus someone who genuinely just wants to teach what their belief is on the Bible and why they wholeheartedly believe what they believe. You can find those whether they're teaching rabbis, whether they're Catholics, whether they're different denominations of the Protestant faith. How's that?
In Proverbs, is it Proverbs 18:13? He that answereth the matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame unto him. I've been through that over and over. I get all this is gonna say, and somebody cuts me off and just has the floor and just hogs it. They won't hear me. So people left with the wrong idea. So this has happened so many times. I've been shut down by teachers, and it might be, I suppose it'd be one of the controversial, topics. But I had stuff I wanted to say, and they violated that verse, I guess.
Well, and there's a possibility that there would be a time for a discussion between two individuals versus a time for a teacher presenting a topic in a study where they have so much material to get through and a time constraint to be able to present to everybody and not be able to devote enough time to a devoted conversation.
And then I locked horns with my brother, and he was all proud of himself, and just stuff I wanted to speak, we just locked horns.
Yep, and sometimes we can come to an impasse and have to take a step back. Yeah. Yes.
I can also agree with you. There's times where I would be on a one-on-one individual, and I would let them have their turn and speak, and then it would be my turn, and they're like, oh wait, I have this and that, and then they interrupt me, and then it would be a constant battle of trying to speak to one-on-one, and then they're like, well, I made my point, so the conversation's ending. And it would be very disrespectful in a way, because I'm trying to make my point clear just as you made your point clear, And then there would be a group, and I let everyone have their individual, say so, and then when I either speak or someone else speak and they disagree, they interrupt or they just move on to a whole other subject without letting that person be heard or understood, or having the whole group talk about what they said so they can have an understanding of what the whole conversation is about.
Yep, that's very true. And sometimes in those instances, we have to be able to recognize that there's not a position of hearing, a position of listening there, and it's not worthwhile for us to waste our time with trying to force people to listen who don't want to.
And the Lord also went through that in similar ways. He would preach to kids and people and varieties of people, and they would start yelling or cursing on his name, and all he's trying to do is preach about what the Father has taught him. And it's just a symbol of how society is and how people just want what they want and not consider about other people or things or animals or anything. They just want what they want.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to mention, I just thought of something like, when Adam and Eve sinned, imagine if they would have been willing to have a conversation with the Father, and, instead of running and hiding and denying and blaming someone else and everything. What if they would have been willing to take responsibility and apologize and everything like that? Wouldn't that have been a different story? Because they ran and hid and then they blamed someone else, and it just seems like, what if they would have been ready to have a conversation with thought of that.
No, that's a good question to have, you know. Would their response to their sin have changed Yah's response to their sin?
Yeah, and that's what we need to do, is when we mess up, don't run, don't blame someone else, but just be ready for the conversation.
Yes, ma'am.
With a humble heart, so.
Just, this might be the last thing I'm able to say. But, getting to theory and opinions, okay, on subjects that we can't come to. I ran across this a long time ago. Of opinions, there's the uninformed, the informed, and the considered. I'm gonna leave it right there.
Fair enough.
Pardon?
We repeat that.
No, we'll leave it right there, it's already said.
Of opinions, there's the uninformed opinion, the informed opinion, and the considered opinion. Stopping right there.
Yep, that's fair. So if there's no more interjections or objections, then I guess we can move on to our prayer and the Aaronic blessing.